If compound interest really worked the way most people talk about it, the world would look very different. That is where I want to begin. If it were really true that ordinary people could take a little money, save steadily, wait patiently, and watch that money curve upward into serious wealth almost by natural law, then a great many things about modern life would make no sense. We would be surrounded by comfortable old people who had become rich simply by being disciplined. We would see ordinary workers finishing their careers with large piles of productive wealth, not fragile houses, shrinking pension promises, and a vague prayer that Social Security or the state will still be standing when they need it. We would not see young people working harder than their parents and owning less. We would not see housing, land, stocks, and every other meaningful asset drifting farther away from the average family. With each passing cycle, we would not see the rich getting richer faster than the underlying economy itself is growing. But we do see all of those things. And once you sit with that long enough, the obvious question arrives. If compound interest is the great democratic engine of wealth, why are so few people actually getting rich from it? That is the question behind this entire discussion. Not the slogan, not the motivational poster, not the fantasy curve on social media where a small monthly deposit turns into a millionaire's balance, while some cheerful narrator tells you that all you need is patience. The real question is much harsher. Why does the theory sound so generous while the reality looks so selective? I think the answer is uncomfortable, but simple. Compound interest is real. What people misunderstand is who it works best for, under what conditions, and at whose expense once an economy reaches its physical limits. That is the actual issue. Now let me begin fairly, because I do not want to cheat the idea. Compound interest, mathematically, is beautiful. You start with some principal, you earn a return. The next year's return is earned not only on the original amount, but on the prior gains as well. That means growth builds on growth. 10% on 1,000 gives you 1,100, 10% on 1,100 gives you 1,210. Then the number starts climbing faster. Then the gains start looking almost magical. The line bends upward. Every finance book, every slick retirement calculator, every teenage investing account on social media loves this moment. They love showing the curve. They love showing a line that starts low, then slowly rises, then suddenly turns upward in a way that feels like financial destiny, finally revealing itself to the patient believer. And there is a reason that story is so attractive. It flatters a certain kind of morality: work hard, save consistently, delay gratification. Wait long enough, and eventually the machine rewards you. It sounds clean. It sounds fair. It sounds like capitalism behaving like a wise schoolmaster, patiently rewarding discipline. I understand why people want to believe it. Part of me always wanted to believe it too, because there is something deeply appealing about a world where modest, steady, disciplined effort can build real independence without needing drama, inheritance, political influence, or luck. But the world does not merely run on mathematics. It runs on institutions, time, biology, asset ownership, class structure, and physical limits. That is why compound interest in the real world behaves very differently from compound interest on a classroom whiteboard. The first place it breaks down is the human life itself. This is the first mechanism I want you to understand. I call it the life cycle trap. The social media version of compounding quietly assumes that you are always in the saving phase. That is the hidden fantasy. It imagines a person who begins with some money, adds more money regularly, receives consistent positive returns, and continues doing that for an absurdly long stretch without major interruption. That is not human life. Human life is lumpy. Human life leaks. Human life moves through phases that are financially hostile to the very smooth curve, the compound. Interest evangelists love to draw. At the beginning of adult life, most people are not building wealth. They are climbing out of a hole. Student loans, low early earnings, deposit needs, relocation costs, unstable work, rent, training, a car they need to survive, an apartment they do not really want but can barely afford. The chart does not start at zero for many people. It starts below zero. That matters. Then comes the middle, the phase everyone treats as the compounding sweet spot. Fine, This is the part where a person is supposed to save. But even here, life keeps interrupting the purity of the curve. Marriage, divorce, children, child care, home repair, parent support, health costs, periods of unemployment, career transitions, economic downturns, broken roofs, cars dying at the wrong time, raising teenagers, helping an adult child who was promised a world that no longer exists. All of that comes out of the beautiful little graph, and then comes old age. The phase, the compounding fairy tale, tends to treat almost as an afterthought. This is where the illusion becomes cruelest, because old age is expensive, not in an exciting way, not in a yacht and villa way, in a slow, humiliating maintenance of the body way, medicine, specialists, mobility equipment, home adjustments, care visits, residential care, the long, grinding cost of simply continuing to exist with dignity when the body is no longer your silent ally. That is where many families discover the ugliest truth in personal finance. What looked like wealth in your 60s was often just retirement survival money in disguise. This is one reason so many grandparents seem asset, rich in the middle of later life, and then die with far less than their children imagined. The wealth was not fake, but it was never a moonshot. It was fuel. It was there to be burned. That is the life cycle trap. The graph that goes to the moon is not your actual life. Your actual life looks more like a long rise with interruptions, shocks, plateaus, and then a slow drawdown, as the accumulated pile gets consumed by retirement and age. That does not mean saving is pointless. It means the fantasy is false. You are not usually compounding into dynastic abundance. You are often saving just enough to avoid dependence later. That is a completely different story. Now, some people hear that and say, fine, maybe individuals do not ride the curve all the way to the moon, but society does. This is the second lie, hidden inside the compound interest myth. People say that even if individuals have uneven lives, the economy itself still compounds. Production builds on production, capital builds on capital, tools create better tools. Each year society becomes richer, more productive, more advanced, and more abundant, and therefore the people inside it can ride along. That is the desert is land version of economics. And in one sense, if you begin with a truly underdeveloped environment, with open resources, unused land, untapped energy, unbuilt infrastructure, and plenty of room to expand, then yes, compounding in society can feel miraculous. You build a farm, then a house, then better tools, then storage, then roads, then machinery, then factories, then networks, then all the rest. Each productive layer enables the next one. That is how early industrial takeoff feels. It feels like the economy is discovering a ladder to the sky. But that model quietly assumes something enormous. It assumes room to expand, room to build, room to absorb new growth without having to fight too hard over what already exists. And that is the second mechanism. I call it the finite island problem. The island is never actually infinite. At first, when the land is fresh and the economy is immature, growth can feel compounding because there is so much underused space. You can still build outward. You can still transform unused natural and human potential into new productive capacity. But eventually, the good land is owned, the infrastructure exists, the cities are established, the prime assets have names on them, the legal titles are already written, the market is no longer mainly about building into emptiness. It becomes increasingly about who owns the already valuable things. That is the turning point. And once an economy reaches that stage, compound growth behaves very differently. The wealthy still compound. The society stops compounding as quickly. That is the real split. This is why it is so dangerous when people lazily repeat that the economy always grows without asking who is capturing that growth and how much room for genuine expansion still exists. Mature economies do not compound in the same clean frontier way younger economies sometimes can. Growth slows. The pie does not stop moving, but it moves far more slowly. The open frontier closes, and then the deeper conflict begins. If the rich continue to grow their wealth at 5, 6, or 7%, while the mature economy itself is growing at 1 or 2%, Where does the extra wealth come from? That is the question nobody asks often enough, because the answer is politically explosive. If the economy as a whole is no longer expanding fast enough to support everyone compounding upward together, then the compounding of the very wealthy increasingly happens through ownership concentration, asset inflation, and the transfer of claims over existing resources. That is a very different process from the fairy tale. This is not society heroically building new abundance for everyone. This is already wealthy people claiming more and more of what exists. That is what I think most people miss. They still imagine wealth as though it is being created in proportion to value for the whole society. Some of it is, of course it is. Businesses do innovate. Productivity does improve. Real value is created. I am not a child, I know that. But in a mature, finite economy, a huge portion of what looks like compounding wealth at the top is not frontier creation. It is capture. Capture of land, capture of housing, capture of equity claims, capture of digital platforms, capture of media, capture of productive assets that ordinary people once might have owned in more distributed form. That is why the world now feels the way it does. That is why house prices rise faster than wages. That is why asset owners celebrate while non-owners fall behind. That is why parents comfort themselves that at least their home is worth more while their children increasingly have no realistic path to buying one. That is why stock markets can surge while the social mood sours. That is why ordinary workers keep being told to start investing early in a world where the ticket to meaningful investing is itself getting more expensive. The rich are still compounding. The middle is increasingly being eaten. That is the third mechanism. I call it the ownership funnel. At first, in a growing society, ordinary families can imagine themselves climbing into ownership. A house, a pension, some shares, a small business, some land, enough of a claim on the productive system that they can ride the wave too. But once the top compounds faster than the underlying economy, the ownership funnel narrows. The best assets rise in price faster than labor income. More people get trapped in wage dependence. Renting replaces owning. Asset appreciation becomes a story told by parents and grandparents rather than a lived reality for their children. And then something perverse happens. The very process that is destroying the future middle class often flatters the current one. This is where the compound interest myth becomes socially poisonous. A family owns one house. The house doubles or triples over time. They feel richer. Their balance sheet says they are richer. Politicians tell them they are richer. Television tells them they are richer. What they often fail to see is that this price increase is not mainly evidence that their class is winning. It is often evidence that the next generation is being priced out. That is the cruelty. One generation gets to feel wealthier precisely because the asset is becoming harder for the next generation to acquire. This is the Esau trade, though most people do not recognize it while they are making it. They accept a near-term feeling of wealth in exchange for a long-term loss of broad ownership for their children and grandchildren. They celebrate the rising asset because the system taught them to read price as progress. But the rising asset is often a sign of enclosure, of the gate moving farther away, of the middle class becoming a shrinking inheritance rather than a living condition. That is why I react so differently to house price celebrations than most people do. When ordinary people cheer asset inflation without asking whether the next generation can still buy in, they are not celebrating shared progress. They are cheering the narrowing of the funnel. This is why compound interest, in the real social sense, does not enrich everybody. It stratifies everybody. Now, I want to say something more personal because this part matters. I know what it means to be on the owning side of the ledger. I know what it feels like to earn enough capital, early enough, to have choices about where it goes. And one of the most revealing things you discover once you have capital is that the romance of investing in productive growth is often much weaker than people assume. In soft economies, a great many genuinely productive investments struggle. Restaurants fail, new ventures stall, consumer-facing businesses get crushed. Real expansion into the productive frontier can be much harder than the textbooks suggest, especially when mass purchasing power is already under pressure. And meanwhile, what works? Existing assets, stocks, property, gold, scarcity, claims on the already desirable. That is not because the owners are all evil. It is because capital follows return. If the highest returns increasingly come from owning and revaluing existing scarce things, then capital will flow there. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the productivity retreat. When an economy no longer offers enough clean frontier for broad productive expansion, wealth does not stop moving. It retreats into the ownership of existing assets. It becomes more rent-seeking, more defensive, more extractive, and less socially generative. That is the phase so many developed economies are now in. And it explains why the compound interest story feels so false to ordinary people, even when the math itself remains true. The math is true. The social application is crooked. The people with large asset bases are compounding on ownership. The people with only labor income are being told to be patient, while asset prices run away from them. That is not a shared compounding story. That is a class transfer story. This is why I am always suspicious of financial influencer advice that treats compound interest like a universal ladder. It is not universal. It is heavily path-dependent. It favors those who get ownership claims early enough, cheaply enough, and in large enough size before the funnel narrows too far. Everyone else is told to save from wages in a world where wages no longer buy meaningful claims as easily as they used to. That is not wisdom. That is historical lateness disguised as timeless advice. Now, to be fair, there are still individuals who use patient investing to improve their lives materially. I would never deny that. Broad indexing, disciplined saving, and long-term ownership can absolutely still beat pure consumption and hand-to-mouth living. Of course they can. I have spent too long respecting ownership to pretend otherwise. But that is a very different sentence from the one most people hear. The honest sentence is this: compound interest can help some ordinary people preserve and improve their position. The dishonest sentence is this: compound interest is the path by which the average family will become meaningfully rich in a mature, unequal economy. And it matters that it is fiction because fiction keeps people docile. If you believe the main problem is that ordinary people simply are not patient enough, disciplined enough, or financially literate enough, then you do not need to look at the tax code, at wealth concentration, at housing policy, at asset inflation, at pension design, at inheritance structures, or at the way the rich keep buying a larger share of the island. You can blame character. That is very convenient for the winners. But it is not true. The fifth mechanism is what I call the compounding asymmetry. The rich do not experience compounding the way ordinary people do. For them, compounding often sits on top of already owned productive assets, tax advantages, legal structures, lower borrowing costs, privileged access, and the ability to hold through volatility without liquidation pressure. For ordinary people, compounding usually sits on top of wage fragility, interrupted saving, high living costs, poor entry prices, and the risk that the savings may have to be consumed for survival before the magic ever has time to matter. Those are different universes. This is why I get so irritated when people talk about investing as if everybody is standing on the same starting line, with the same time horizon, the same risk tolerance, the same liquidity needs, and the same access to assets. No, one family is compounding on top of a six-figure or seven-figure asset base with tax help and patience. Another family is trying to compound a few $100s a month while rent, child care, insurance, food, and age-related care stand ready to consume the very pile that was supposed to become their freedom. And then the market philosopher shows up and tells both families that the same lesson applies equally. That is nonsense. The mathematics may be neutral. History is not. Now, where does this leave us? It leaves us with a much more serious understanding of what has to change if we do not want our children and grandchildren to inherit a country where the rich own everything meaningful and the middle exists only as memory, imagery, and old family stories. The answer is not to abolish saving. The answer is not to sneer at ownership. The answer is not to deny compounding. The answer is to change the tax and ownership structure so that the compounding of great fortunes stops overwhelming the compounding possibilities of ordinary families. That means lower tax pressure on work, higher tax pressure on very large concentrations of wealth. It means refusing to pretend that labor and capital should be treated as though they deserve identical favoritism when one side is already outrunning the whole economy. It means understanding that once wealth concentration becomes too extreme, the tax system is no longer merely collecting revenue. It is deciding whether the society will continue to have a middle class at all. That is the real issue. Not whether a famous physicist said something memorable about compound interest. I could not care less about that. What I care about is the future ownership map of the country. Who owns land, who owns housing, who owns shares, who owns media, who owns digital infrastructure, who owns the tools and machines of the next generation, because wherever compounding at the top is allowed to outrun the living growth of the underlying society, the answer to those questions becomes more concentrated over time. And that concentration has consequences, economic consequences, political consequences, psychological consequences. When people can no longer realistically buy into ownership, they become more fragile, more resentful, more dependent on institutions they do not trust, and more vulnerable to every kind of demagogue who promises vengeance without structure. This is why I say inequality is not just a moral issue. It is a system stability issue. A society without a broad ownership class becomes brittle. A brittle society may still have high paper wealth at the top. It becomes much uglier beneath that paper. Now let me put all of this in one plain sentence. Compound interest is not failing. It is succeeding. It is just succeeding much more for the people who already own the island. That is the real truth. And if you want ordinary families to have a meaningful chance to build and keep wealth over generations, you cannot simply tell them to save harder while the ownership funnel narrows, the asset prices rise, and the tax system protects the already rich more carefully than it protects the wage earner. You have to intervene in the structure. That means taxation. That means wealth concentration. That means policy. That means being adult enough to say that a finite economy cannot permit limitless compounding at the top without eventually devouring the class beneath it. That is what is happening now. The rich are not just getting richer. They are buying the future. And a country where the future is bought too early, too completely, and by too few people is not a healthy country. It is merely a country still flattering itself with old stories while the ownership map changes underneath. That is why I do not want you leaving this discussion with a shallow conclusion. The shallow conclusion is that compound interest is a lie. It is not. The deeper conclusion is harder and more useful. Compound interest is a real force, but in a finite, unequal economy, it stops being a universal ladder and becomes a machine for accelerating ownership concentration, unless politics, taxation, and institutional design push back hard enough to keep the island broadly shared. That is the actual fight, not mathematics against ignorance, ownership against exclusion. That is why I care so much about wealth taxes, not because I hate rich people, because I understand arithmetic in the real world. If the wealthy can keep compounding faster than the economy can grow, while ordinary people are told to trust patience and work from shrinking starting positions, then the middle class eventually becomes a temporary historical event. I do not want that world. You should not want it either. And if you want to resist it, then the right response is not to abandon discipline. The right response is to combine discipline with structural honesty. Save, yes, own, yes, invest, yes. But stop telling fairy tales about how everybody can ride the same curve in a world where the assets are already being cornered, and then demand a tax and ownership system that gives the next generation a real chance to enter the game instead of merely watching the winners compound farther away. That is the real lesson. Not that compound interest is fake, that in the wrong society, compound interest becomes class cannibalism with a motivational slogan attached. Once you see that clearly, the whole conversation changes, and it should.